The rain hammered against the window, each drop a reminder that she was utterly alone. A flash of lightning illuminated the figure standing at the edge of a driveway, motionless, watching. He had no face. At least, not one she could recognize. Instead, where his eyes should have been, there were two endless black voids, empty yet terrifyingly full of malice. Why is he just standing there? Her heart raced as she pulled the curtains tight, praying he wouldn't move closer. But in her gut, she knew it wouldn't be that simple. No one ever came back from meeting the black-eyed stranger. Lena moved through her small one-story house with a sense of unease that had settled in since the first sighting of the man outside. The house was old, creaky, and isolated, perfectly in tune with the thunderous storm that roared outside. Lightning lit up the dark forest surrounding her home, momentarily revealing glimpses of twisted trees and eerie shadows that danced menacingly in the howling wind. The smell of damp wood and the musty scent of the ancient furniture filled the room, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. Every sound in the house felt amplified: the creak of the floorboards beneath her feet, the groan of the walls straining against the wind, and most unsettling of all, the faint tapping at the window. It was as if the house itself was whispering to her, warning her of something far more sinister than the storm. She felt a cold draft on the back of her neck and spun around, eyes wide, but there was nothing there. "Calm down, Lena. It's just the storm." But deep inside, she knew it wasn't. 2 weeks ago, Lena had moved to this house for a fresh start after the sudden death of her brother, Daniel. The death had been ruled an accident, but Lena had never believed it. She had been haunted by strange phone calls and cryptic notes since his passing. The words scribbled in each note were always the same: "He sees you." That night, after receiving another ominous note, Lena felt as if someone was watching her. When she looked out her window, she saw him for the first time, the black-eyed stranger, standing motionless at the edge of the woods. She thought it might have been a trick of the light. But no, the figure was there every night since, never moving, never making a sound. Just watching. Tonight was different, though. She hadn't received a note yet, but the figure was still there, this time closer than ever. Lena took a deep breath, steeling herself. She wasn't going to run anymore. She needed to know who this man was, and why he wouldn't leave her alone. Grabbing a flashlight, she yanked on her raincoat and threw open the door, stepping into the pouring rain. Each step felt heavy, as if the ground was pulling her back, begging her to stay inside. But she was determined to confront whatever this was. As she reached the driveway, the figure vanished, leaving behind only the cold, biting rain and a chilling whisper carried by the wind. "You're next." Lena froze, every muscle in her body screaming to run back inside. But before she could move, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned, flashlight shaking in her grasp, only to see no one there. Her heart hammered in her chest as she stumbled backward, breathing heavy. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet shifted, the earth giving way to something soft and squelching. Her light flickered toward the ground, only to reveal a fresh grave. Her brother's grave. This can't be real. Lena wasn't someone who scared easily. She had faced grief, loss, and the darker sides of life more than most. Her brother Daniel had been everything to her. They grew up in a troubled household, depending on each other for survival. When Daniel died, a part of her had died too. But this, whatever was happening, this wasn't something she could explain with logic or reason. She was a practical woman, worked as a journalist, used to chasing down facts, uncovering truths. Yet, here she was, standing in the middle of her driveway, staring at a grave that had no right to be there. The black-eyed stranger was tormenting her, and she couldn't understand why. "I'm not crazy," she whispered to herself. "I'm not." But the harder she tried to convince herself, the more she felt her mind unraveling. Was the stranger real, or had her grief manifested into something darker, something that wanted to consume her entirely? As she stood there in the rain, lost in thought, she heard a faint whisper, close to her ear, "I see you." The following days felt like a game of cat and mouse. Lena kept seeing the figure everywhere, outside her window, in the reflection of her mirrors, even in the photographs on her phone. Each time, he seemed closer. Each time, his eyes were the same, dark, empty, yet filled with something that made her blood run cold. She tried to get help. She reached out to old friends, neighbors, even a few local paranormal enthusiasts, but no one believed her. Worse, they treated her like she was losing her mind, as if grief had driven her into delusions. But the notes kept coming, and the whispering grew louder. "You're next." The final straw came when Lena found the message carved into the walls of her bedroom. The words were deep, jagged, like something had clawed its way into her home. Why won't he leave me alone? It was time. She needed to go back to the place where it all started, the woods behind her house. That's where Daniel had been found. That's where the answers lay. But going into those woods meant facing the darkness she had been running from her whole life. The woods were dense, dark, and suffocating. Every step Lena took felt like she was being watched, as if unseen eyes were peering at her from the shadows. The trees seemed to whisper her name, their branches stretching out like gnarled fingers trying to pull her deeper into the unknown. Her mind raced with thoughts. What if none of this was real? What if she was losing her grip on reality? But she knew, deep down, that it didn't matter. She had to keep going. There was no turning back now. Lena's flashlight flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the trees. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure dart between the trunks, but when she turned, there was nothing. Or was there? She had read enough horror stories to know what came next. The figure would appear behind her, cold hands would wrap around her neck, and the darkness would swallow her whole. But none of that happened. Instead, the voice returned, closer this time. "Lena." She spun around, and there he was, the black-eyed stranger standing only a few feet away. His eyes were bottomless pits, drawing her in, making her question everything she thought she knew. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head, its lips twisting into a grotesque smile. "Because you invited me in." Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away from the figure. "Invited you? I didn't invite anything." But even as she said it, she remembered the night Daniel died. They had played with something they shouldn't have, an old ritual, a game they thought was nothing more than a childish dare. Except it wasn't. "You opened the door," the stranger hissed, his voice echoing around her. "And now, you can never close it." Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet seemed to vanish. Lena felt herself falling into an endless void of darkness. The last thing she saw before everything went black were those empty, soulless eyes. As Lena slipped into unconsciousness, flashes of memories came rushing back, moments she had tried to forget. Daniel, holding that cursed book, laughing it off like it was a joke. The strange noises they heard that night, the feeling of something watching them ever since. And the final note she had found just before Daniel's death. "The black-eyed stranger comes for those who summon him. I should have known." When Lena woke, she was no longer in the woods. She was back in her house, lying on the cold, hardwood floor. The rain had stopped, and everything was eerily silent. Too silent. Her body ached, her head throbbed, and her mind was a jumbled mess. Had it all been a dream? But as she sat up, she saw it. The figure standing in the corner of her living room, watching her with those empty eyes. "You can't escape me," it whispered. Lena scrambled to her feet, panic rising in her throat. This wasn't a dream. This was real. He's real. The stranger took a step forward, and Lena's breath caught in her throat. She had no idea how to stop him, no idea how to undo what she and Daniel had unleashed. All she knew was that she was running out of time. Lena's mind raced as she searched for something, anything that could help her. Her eyes darted to the old book, still lying on the coffee table where Daniel had left it all those weeks ago. The ritual. There had to be a way to reverse it. With trembling hands, she grabbed the book and frantically flipped through its pages, searching for the spell that had started it all. Her heart raced as the stranger moved closer, his presence suffocating, his eyes boring into her soul. "Lena," he whispered, his voice dripping with malice. "It's too late." But just as he reached her, Lena found the page. She began chanting the words, her voice shaky but determined. The stranger paused, his smile fading. The air around them grew thick, oppressive. Lena felt a pressure building in her chest, as if the very room was closing in on her. But she kept chanting, her words gaining strength, her resolve unshakable. Suddenly, the stranger let out a blood-curdling scream, his body writhing as if being torn apart from the inside. His eyes, those horrible black voids, locked onto hers one last time before he exploded into a cloud of shadowy mist. And then, silence. Lena collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. It was over, or so she thought. As she looked down at the book in her hands, she noticed something chilling. The final line of the ritual was missing, as if it had been deliberately torn out. "You can never close the door." A cold wind swept through the room, and for the briefest moment, Lena saw a familiar figure standing at the edge of her vision, watching, waiting. The black-eyed stranger was gone. For now. Is he really gone, or is this just the beginning? To find out what happens next, check out our next terrifying tale, Whispers in the Dark, a haunting you'll never forget. Click now if you dare.